Okay, it's 8:05 on my clock, so we'll get started for tonight's presentation. Good evening and welcome everybody to webinar number 3 in our series of 8 virtual sessions we'll be offering this year to U16 players, parents, and coaches. My name is Scott Stevens and I am the Manager of Programs and Events for the Ontario Hockey Federation. I'll be acting as the moderator for tonight's call. All 8 live virtual presentations will be recorded, so all players, parents, and coaches will have the opportunity to go back and watch, as well as download the PowerPoint slide decks. All presentations and slide decks are available on the OHF website under the heading Players, Program of Excellence, and then under 16 AAA Program of Excellence. We're strongly encouraging everyone to attend the live events to capitalize on interacting with our presenters through our Q&A sections at the end of each presentations. So right now I'm going to go through a couple meeting rules. If you wish to ask a question, raise your hand virtually, and myself as the moderator will connect you to your question. Please state your name, which team you're with, and then your question. Be brief and to the point to allow for the greatest opportunity, and you will have the opportunity for one follow-up question. And hopefully this doesn't happen, but if someone is belligerent or not respecting the ground rules, they may be removed from the meeting. So like I mentioned before, there will be a Q&A section at the conclusion of the presentation. But if you have a question during the discussion on a topic, you can raise your hand or enter the question in the chat and we will get to it. If asking a question, I will enable your mic and address you by name before asking your question. When asking your question, again, please state your name, team name, and association. For tonight's webinar, I want to introduce Andrew Hopf, who is the lead strength and conditioning coach with the University of Waterloo Department of Athletics and Recreation. Andrew is also the development strength and conditioning coach of the St. Louis Blues of the National Hockey League. Tonight, Andrew will be focusing on advanced preparation and activation. On behalf of the group in attendance and the Ontario Hockey Federation, thank you, Andrew, for taking the time tonight and welcome. I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Scott. Can you hear me okay? Just a quick thumbs up. Perfect. So thank you for having me on. It's always grateful for this time. This is a time during a busy time of everyone's season, and I'm very grateful for everyone being here. My hope is tonight we're going to go through during the in-person U15 Program of Excellence work that we did last year. We went through some fundamentals of how to warm up properly. The whole goal of tonight is to expand upon that and kind of challenge the assumption that activation protocols should just be used to warm up. But instead, could they be used to actually create a training effect? I've been doing this for my entire professional career. After I finished my graduate work at the University of Waterloo back in 2009, I started at that point to work with the Owen Sound Attack in the OHL. So I worked in the OHL for 8 years or so, and then came back to head up the leadership of our strength and conditioning program at the University of Waterloo, and then also took on the role with the St. Louis Blues back in 2018 as their development strength coach, where I take newly drafted players, whether from the OHL, WHL, Europe, NCAA, whatever it is, and help guide them in terms of their behaviors, strategies that are going to be required to become professional athletes. All of that to say that I've seen a lot of athletes. I've seen a lot of players go through this system, a lot of teams prepare. And I think, a couple things that come to mind is most teams are going to warm up, especially when it comes to pregame. You kind of go to the rink and you see players doing your line work. Some players have their own protocols, but in general, most players and most teams are going to do some sort of warm-up protocol prior to gameplay. The challenge is when we start to talk about practice time. Very few players that I've seen, even at the OHL level, are dedicating the time and I would say intent into preparing their bodies physically to be optimal during that practice time. Again, I'm not painting everyone the same brush, but these are some observations that I've made. And my guess is at the minor hockey level, a lack of a warm-up may be even more prevalent. Warm-ups are kind of done, but for lack of a better way of saying it, a lot of kids just kind of do them. They just kind of go through the motions a little bit without a deeper understanding of the components and also a comprehension of how it aligns with their kind of greater development plan. I think if there's any players, I don't know if there's players or parents on this call, but we can attest that when we're kind of doing the work, we're just kind of doing it without a deeper understanding of why the heck am I doing this? How is this actually creating more mobility? How is this creating higher levels of activation, if you will? They're going to help my propulsive abilities. And that's really the goal of tonight, is to help us all understand on a deeper level why it is that we're advocating for this type of work prior to any level of physical activity, and how can you kind of optimize that. When we think about the period in which we should be warming up, it actually is a very significant window of time in your season that you can take advantage of. We always think about, training sessions, if you will, have to be at the gym, or they have to be during this concentrated 75-minute window when you're with your team doing a team training session. But when we look at the time frame that you theoretically should be preparing physically for practices and gameplay, we're probably talking about 100 minutes a week. So how can we utilize this time much better to, yes, warm up, but then also create some sort of learning and adaptation kind of scenario that our body can actually develop throughout the competitive season? Why warm up in the first place? Performance is increased. Up to in 80% of the cases, performance is increased throughout after you do a warm-up protocol. Injury risk mitigation is the next piece. Although the evidence is a little bit wishy-washy on that, on how much it will, but we know with a high degree of certainty that performance will be increased following a warm-up protocol. What are the components of the warm-up? If anybody on here has been part of the U15 Program of Excellence, you have heard me say this before. It's called the RMAP system. So R standing for raising our internal body temperature, M standing for mobilizing tissue or joints that require mobility, and then finally, what we're going to focus a lot on tonight is activating and grooving motor patterns and pathways, and prime and potentiate. So truly in a progressive manner, getting our bodies ramped up to the level of activation that's going to be required in sport, in training, in practice, and then also in a very, very specific way to whatever the task is going to be within that activity session. Raise and mobilize. We're not going to spend a ton of time on this, but I think that there's value in just touching on them. So again, raising internal body temperature. This is where we just come in and literally just, for lack of a better way of saying it, get the body moving. We're trying to facilitate blood flow. We are trying to see a gentle raise in internal body temperature. We're trying to get our metabolic system a little bit more active than it was prior to us coming to the rink or going to the gym. This is meant to be a very low impact, non-specific, non-fatiguing sort of scenario that is relatively short in length. We quite often hear, oh, we're going to get on the bike, or we're going to whatever it is. My advocacy for this is we want to be locomotive in nature. So a brisk walk, as simple as that sounds, but a brisk walk for 6 minutes is enough. And it also starts to kind of get your body into that rhythm of actually moving. Next is mobilization. Again, a hugely important component to any physical preparation time period, but it is at this point that we're really thinking about joint by joint mobilization strategies. So going after our ankle and trying to encourage more ankle, what's called dorsiflexion. In the world of hockey, our foot is kind of locked in our boot, but if we actually can start to get more ankle mobility, we're going to lengthen and elongate our stride. If we're able to do that, our change of direction ability improves, our acceleration ability improves, lots happens. After that, we're going to go up to our hip. Our hip is a multiplanar joint, and I think we can all appreciate, if we haven't played in a while and we go out there and attack a sprint on the ice, our hips are going to be relatively hypertonic or tight after. We want to mobilize our hips in multiple directions. Thoracic spine, we want to move. So thoracic spine, meaning kind of where our rib cage is up to our neck. We want to encourage movement in that joint. And then finally our shoulder. Traditionally, these sorts of patterns, and we're not going to, this is an activation and potentiation talk tonight, but I wanted to talk on this. Usually we're holding for 3 to 5 seconds for 3 to 5 reps per side with these mobilization strategies. Again, I would encourage you after the fact, if you have questions, bring it up in the Q&A. But the options that are available to us to actually to do mobilization work are really endless. There's probably 50 different ankle mobility drills and 100 different hip mobility drills. I'm going to challenge us to say, are we really thinking about all these things? Once we kind of get through these couple components, now we're going to start to talk about activation and potentiation. And I think this is where there presents a ton of opportunity for young hockey players to not only prepare better for sport in training, but if used strategically to actually see performance adaptations over the course of time. So what are we trying to achieve here? We're trying to turn on motor pathways that are required for locomotion and or joint stability to make the movement more efficient. So it's almost as though we're trying to tell our bodies, hey, here's the direction we want to go. Here's what the map looks like. Here's how we actually move fluidly through this range of patterns. All right. The last thing we would want to do before we actually attack a rep on the ice or in the gym is to say, oh, well, I don't know what I'm doing, and just kind of hammer away at it. This is a process that we can gently introduce the movement to our body, and then we start to add layers of complexity and challenge to it as we progressively ramp up towards practice gameplay lift. Okay. The next part of that we're trying to achieve here is we're trying to decrease the thresholds that are required to recruit what's called fast twitch motor fibers. And I think we've all heard the saying fast twitch, but what it means is fast twitch fibers are these fibers that can create a ton of force. Not only a ton of force, but they can create force very, very quickly. And obviously this is going to be hugely important for acceleration, change of direction, and being quick on the ice. If we can lower the threshold that's required to activate these fibers, the likelihood of them activating is going to be a lot better, meaning that we can accelerate and change directions faster and all that kind of good stuff. Okay. Lastly, what are we trying to achieve here is progressively and strategically ramp our bodies up, not only to the level of effort that's going to be required in that given session, but also things that are activate in a way that's more specific to whatever's going to happen. So for example, if I was ramping up, knowing that I'm going on the ice and I'm doing a hard battle type practice, the last few things that I might do before that practice are going to be significantly different than if I were ramping up to a heavy strength session in the gym where the first thing I'm doing is a back squat or something like that, for example. All right. And we're going to go through the mechanisms of that as we go into a little bit more detail. What are these patterns? So these are movements or patterns where essentially force is being generated through a specific pathway or group of motor units to create locomotion. And when I mean motor units, I mean kind of a group of nerves that go to a muscle group. Okay, so it'd be whatever, like my femoral nerve that's going down to my quad, for example. All right, so it's a group of nerves that's turning on a specific group of muscles, or it is a pattern or a movement pattern that we will quite often see in sport. A lot of these movements, especially when it comes down to activation, are done with varying levels of resistance. So in the beginning, like we'll see, we might be working on gross motor abilities where we're just grooving patterns. That might be done without resistance. And then the next stage up would be a group of patterns that will be done with resistance. If we start to do things against resistance, that's where those concepts of lowering thresholds, the recruit type 2 fibers, more truly neuromuscular activation are kind of come into play. Resistance, in this form, I do not necessarily mean external weight per se in the form of barbells and dumbbells and things like that. Normally in this protocol, we're using bands, using some sort of fixed structure like a wall or a squat rack or a bench, using a partner or perhaps a ball as the true resistance to get things to actually turn on. These patterns are going to be done in multiple planes. We as athletes, we operate in multiple planes. Traditionally, we're trying to create locomotion or acceleration in what's called the sagittal plane, where we're trying to sprint usually in a straight line or perhaps with some slight deviation from point A to point B. But point A to point B might be across my body in the frontal plane, where I'm doing a crossover or a shuffle or some sort of karaoke drill. So we're trying to kind of activate these patterns in multiple planes that are going to be needed in sport to create acceleration and propulsion. These patterns can be rhythmic in nature. When we actually get into moving fast, we don't want this to be done in a flailing way where we're exerting all of this energy. There's what we call a high metabolic cost to go from point A to point B. We want to be fluid. We want to be rhythmic. So a lot of these patterns in this activation protocol are meant to start to groove movement fluidity in a way that we can move in a very, very efficient way. So we're not burning energy, requiring more energy to do a certain job. And like I said, these patterns are progressively increased in intensity and specificity as we get closer and closer to whatever the task is going to be in front of us. So like I said before, I want to change the narrative. This isn't, yes, it is going to be part of a really, really well-structured warm-up, but can these patterns be used for more than just warming up? Can we make strategic decisions that are going to expand our movement toolkit? So I like it. Everyone who would be listening to this call is in the kind of post-pubescent, so your late stage puberty, maybe you're still mid-stage puberty, and your body essentially, if we're trying to turn you into a athletic mechanic, if you will. And it is during these times when you can invest to expand your motor toolkit. So whatever athletic job is going to be asked of you, you can go and call upon it instead of us just turning you into a hammer. All right, we're kind of the quote unquote way of is all you see is nails, right? That might get you so far, but in many cases we have to express a lot of different patterns, and those who are listening to the call at this age are still in that kind of learn to train to train, where we're trying to expand our movement competency and literacy at the same time. And the last thing I want to think about is, well, can these movements actually accumulate to a training adaptation over time, right? Can we aggressively challenge these movements in a way that our body's going to have to adapt to, that are actually going to increase our horsepower and our efficiency over time? And my argument is yes, we can. So activation components. I'm just going to kind of start this video. It's muted, and I'm going to talk over it as we go. So like I said before, component one of activation is what I call neuromuscular. So we're trying to turn on motor units. So you see here in this video, I'm oops, what happened there? There we go. I'm doing what's called a mini band series. So I'm doing a bunch of movements in different planes where I'm doing against a banded resistance. We call this the mini band series because I'm going to present a series of 4 or 5 different drills that we quite often use prior to. So the first drill that you would have saw, if I just kind of go back, and hopefully this works, it looks like it is called the bent leg lateral walk. So essentially I'm more in an athletic position, and the common language that we're using here is push. All right, I'm trying to push the ground away. So with this one, my left leg is being loaded. I'll start at the beginning, right leg loaded here, and I'm trying to extend my right leg out, left leg coming back. My body is traveling as I go, and I'm remaining stable up in my trunk. So as I kind of do that, I'm trying to, yes, turn on my glute. I'm trying to turn on my quad, but I'm also grooving the pattern of creating propulsion and accelerating in that frontal plane, right? So that's the bent leg lateral walk. Next one that I'm presenting here is a straight leg lateral walk. This is more of a specifically turning on my gluteal complex. So as I do this, I'm actually flexing my quad quite a bit as a means of actually trying to specifically isolate my glute. All right, so that's the bent straight leg lateral walk. Next one I'm getting into is an acceleration step, and I'll kind of freeze it right here. So, and that goes over top. I don't want the ads. So as I kind of look in this position, this might look like a position that we would see if we're starting to sprint, if we're starting to actually skate where my front leg is loaded, right? Yes, I have resistance here, but I'm actually kind of just doing it to load my front leg and get that into a position that I'm going to be able to accelerate off of. From here, what I'm actually going to do is drive through my front leg to get to the top position. So yes, this is under resistance, but this is more of a primer for the next drill that's going to be coming, the accel step with liftoff. Again, the common language I'm using here is push. Next drill, accel step with liftoff. So with this, I'm getting in my acceleration position, meaning a positive shin angle. My back leg is as straight as I can. It should be straight. I'm going to critique my own technique there as I watch this. Back leg is straight and I'm lifting off. And that's meant to be a tool where I'm actually, again, activating glute. And that's going to be a common language you hear from a motor unit perspective. We're trying to turn on our glute, turn on our core. Next drill we're going to do is called a V step. So like I said, we move in multiple planes as athletes, and we need to turn on multiple planes. So now you're kind of seeing me extend and drive away and push the ground. Last one I have is more of a hip flexor activation drill. Again, I'm pushing the ground away, but I'm bringing that other leg up into kind of a hip flex position under resistance. Okay, so those are 5, 6 really good examples of mini band type drills that you can do as part of your activation protocols. It's going to take up little space. Again, well, like I said, these drills can be progressed in nature. Here I'm doing a relatively light band, but as you get more and more capable and you adapt to it, you can increase the density of the band. You can also start to move that band closer to your toes, right? So now you're going to get it around the ball of your foot or even close to your toes. That's going to increase the challenge that you're going to have to overcome to actually make that thing happen. If you're new and you're not really sure of it and your strength isn't there yet, then you can move it up to your knees, right? So like I said, we want these warm-ups to be progressive in nature, but also regressive in nature because stuff happens, injuries happen, where we might have to bring it back. Another concept that you might see is different forms of isometrics. So I don't have a video of this, but isometrics are essentially fixed movements where you're not moving, but you're pushing against something. We may have heard of things like glute bridges or hip drives, driving our leg into the wall. So I call that a hip abduction wall drive. Various single leg balance drills where we're really, we're not moving per se, but again, we're trying to turn on various motor units when we do that. Again, value with this, they're progressive in nature. We don't need a lot of space. We don't need any equipment, but these are really, really effective ways to turn things on. I had sets and reps built into the miniband series with these glute activation drills. These are very, very short duration, 3 to 5 second holds. This isn't like a side plank where you're holding for more of an endurance sort of focus. This is very short, very aggressive movements where you're creating a ton of stability in the joints around what you're actually trying to activate, and you're just driving into a fixed source for a very, very short period of time. Component 2, gross motor ability. So this is where we're going to start to actually move through the types of movements that are going to be needed in sport, right? So again, I'll kind of start this. I have a number of examples here that we go through. And again, I'm thinking about moving in multiple planes. So again, in a lot of cases, we're gonna have a lunging strategy or a squatting strategy. I'm gonna start to groove those sorts of patterns. I'm gonna do it in multiple planes, right? Again, as athletes, we're not moving in just that forward plane. We're moving in multiple planes. With this, I'm doing it without a ton of resistance, right? As soon as I add lunging into it, there's an inherent resistance to that. But I'm being kind of mindful of the faster I go down, the more force is going to be required. With this, again, this is called a hip car. Again, the options are endless. You can pick a million different things, but I'm trying to get us to think about here is selecting things that are going to challenge movement that is global in nature and relatively specific. With this, I'm trying to move my hip through a more complete range, but then also create tension through that entire range. You can go to things where you're working in a single leg type pattern, so a single leg forward reach. As you get into actual strength conditioning and you're dealing with your sessions, now we might actually start about activating hinging patterns. So if you're doing a deadlift or something like that, you want to start to warm up that pattern, pushing patterns, pulling patterns, and things like that. Again, so gross motor ability, again, relatively unloaded patterns that we're moving fluidly through more complete range of motion. The third component to this activation series is more in the realm of rhythm and control. So now we're actually starting to create locomotion, and we want to do things in a very fluid way as a means of creating kind of synchronization across my body and control. It is here that we can start to expand movement complexity and challenge movement patterns and make things more challenging. So again, quite often we'll see concepts of using skipping, right? So A skips, B skips, C skips, lateral A skips, lateral, well, you can't do B skips, lateral A skips with crossovers. So things where we're actually starting to challenge our reactive system, but then also our fluidity. We may start to do karaoke patterns where you have to bring one foot in front, one foot behind. We may actually start to use, if you're going to use the quote unquote agility ladder, this is where you would start to use that sort of patterning. Not because it's going to make you more agile per se, but it's going to inject new coordination patterns and movement patterns that you can kind of play with a little bit. As we're developing, we may do some components of crawling, and this would be a really, really good place to start to groove various side shuffle work, crossover work. As silly as it sounds, and I highly doubt I'm going to go to the rink and see any athletes doing this, but using somersaults, rolling, various getting up off the ground drills would be a great, great thing in this component of your activation. So here we're still not working at a maximal level, but now you can see we're starting to kind of ramp up to the level and specific types of movements that we're going to need in sport and in training. Oops. Now we move into potentiation. And potentiation is a term that really refers back to creating an environment at the neuromuscular level, so where your nerve meets your muscle, and then intramuscularly, where it is more conducive to creating high amounts of force. That's kind of where the word potentiation comes to. So why we want to do this, we want to start to approximate the intensity and specificity of the movement that's going to be needed in sport. I think it's important as well to understand, well, what are we actually trying to achieve in this block of training, and can we actually use this time period to what we call kind of mini dose or micro dose loads. So again, if we are in a power block, for example, can we do some things that are powerful in nature in a very low dose way that is going to not render us unavailable for our sport, but accumulated over time can actually result in a training effect. So it's here that we now talk about concepts of acceleration, deceleration, change of direction, maneuverability type work. I think it's important to note that when we're doing this, none of this is meant to be fatiguing in nature, meaning that when we do it, we don't want to see, if I were used a jump, for example, and we were to do one jump and we achieved a height of X, right? We wouldn't want to see that jump height after we did 15 jumps drop by 40%. That would be a fatiguing scenario. But could we do one jump, take 5 seconds off? One jump, 5 seconds off. One jump, 5 seconds off. It is truly working at a maximal level, but we're not going to expose ourselves to a point where we start to see performance diminish. All right. And that should be a common thread across most of these kind of potentiation protocols. So when we do this, I kind of batch it into two categories. One is going to be very much locomotive in nature. So again, sprinting, change of directions, and maneuverability type drills. We talk about change, and again, the types of drills we can pick are endless. But you want to think about, am I choosing things that kind of meet all of these families? So sprinting's pretty straightforward. That's literally just running fast. Change of directions, that literally means that can be as simple as running and stopping. That can be running one way 10 meters and running back the other way. It could be backpedaling to a sprint. That's what we mean by change direction. You're not reacting to anything. You're literally just changing directions. Maneuverability is you kind of continuing to move from quote unquote point A to point B, but you're just kind of modulating your body in space. So meaning you might be kind of doing an S sprint. So you still kind of go from point A to point B. You're not changing directions, but you're shifting your body position and kind of moving your body as you move towards that destination. Obviously, this is hugely important in sport, especially our sport of hockey. If we think about, a defenseman closing the gap, or you think about a forward attacking a defenseman and changing speeds and changing positions. So again, a really good strategy in terms of specificity as you approach gameplay. The second area to think about is jumps, hops, and bounds. At the end, we're trying to create propulsion. We're trying to create an environment where our body is capable of expressing a lot of force very quickly and directing that force into the ice. Jumps, hops, and bounds are very important tools that are going to tell our bodies we need to push the earth away from us so we can drive in a certain direction. If we were actually training, these are obviously tools that we can use for training as well. So jumps are pretty straightforward. So again, I'm talking taking off 2 feet, landing on 2 feet. Hops is 1 foot to the same foot. There's obviously as soon as we go to 1 foot, the skill that's required to actually execute that is significantly higher than taking off 2 feet and landing off 2 feet, which presents a great environment that we can adapt to in an environment that can be very progressive in nature. So thinking about that and thinking about when we are doing hops, we can do it in multiple directions too. We can do forward, lateral. We can start in a half kneeling position. And then bounding. So bounding would be something that is very similar to the skating stride. So taking off 1 foot and landing on the other foot. When we are doing these things, I think there's a couple of key things we need to remember. We're not just trying to jump, we're trying to drive the earth away from us. All right. So driving the ground away, not just swinging our hips. Right. And this becomes very, very evident when we're doing something like a hop. Right. So again, 1 foot to the same foot, it is really, really common for an athlete to just kind of swing through the movement instead of driving the earth away. It is here that we can really create a scenario where we can adapt to. Second important cue is control, especially when we're doing hops, right? And what I mean by that is control your landings. You being able to control landings on 1 foot, not only in terms of stopping yourself well, but stopping yourself in a position that looks very similar to that Excel step that we talked on, is a really, really good strategy to improve I'll call it your functional range of motion. So the range of motion that you can utilize to actually create power. When we are trying to be reactive in nature, so again, when I say reactive, it's a little different than explosive. It means getting off the ground quick. It's important to incorporate that type of work too. When you are doing it, be mindful of surface and space. If you're dealing with a space, so whatever, I'm based out of the Cambridge area, so I think about something like Galtarina Gardens, where who knows, it might get a little slippery up top. Well, that might not be the best space to do a change of direction work. I think you have to be mindful of this, because the last thing we want to see in any of these situations is someone get hurt doing a warm-up drill. There's no place for that. So I think you have to be mindful of where are you doing it. Are there little 5-year-olds that are going to be ripping in front of you? And if that's the case, then that's just obviously not a good scenario for them or you. All right. So as you're thinking about this, you have to think about, well, how can I maybe switch what I'm deciding on doing to match the facilities that I'm in? So yeah, that's it on that. So big take-home messages. It's crazy how quickly 35 minutes flies by. Take-home messages. Warm-up protocols. When you look at multiple practices a week, my assumption is everyone who's listening to this call is practicing 3 times a week at least, maybe more. You also have probably warm-ups prior to your gym sessions. You have gameplay. So if we say, hey, you theoretically should be warming up for 20 minutes, maybe even more, prior to that very intense bout of exercise that is practice play and gameplay and training in the gym, and you times that by 5 in a week, well, it's at least 100 minutes of time that's available to you to make really, really good decisions per week. You extrapolate that over the course of a season. So whatever, let's say 30 weeks, you have 3,000 minutes of time that you can invest into good decisions. That is huge. So when I hear about, I don't have time to train, garbage. You have time to train if you use this time really, really well. These protocols should be approached with the same mindset that training presents. All right. So in the world of training, people who are listening to this call have hired strength conditioning coaches. All right. You're hiring people to write you really good programs to coach you through these things. I'm challenging us all to think about, well, can my warm-ups be progressed and overloaded in the same way that training is, mindset-wise? I'm not saying that we need to turn warm-ups into a training session, because that would render us unavailable physically for our training session. Again, these warm-up protocols should not be fatiguing in nature. But if we can treat them in the same way that we're looking to progress them, then perhaps we can create a training effect. This is your responsibility. I can promise you this. I go down to St. Louis at training camp. The pros, the Shens, the Parekos, the Binningtons, the Kairus, the Thomases, these guys do not need to be told to warm up. They do not have their hands held. They're not waiting for their buddies to come. They're there. They've established their own protocol that have components to this. If you want to walk the talk and think you're being a pro, if you're not warming up prior to practice plans or practices and you have aspirations to be a pro, how are you going to take their job away? All right. And at the end of the day, like, as you progress to the next level, nothing's handed to you. If you want to take someone's ice time away, you're taking their job away. So if you're not prepared to start to do these little things right now, I would argue you're not ready to be a pro. This is your responsibility. It's not your coach's responsibility. It's not your strength coach's responsibility. It's yours. All right. And I hope that the message tonight has been loud and clear that your physical prep protocols need to have all of those components. That's all I got for tonight. We'll open it up to some questions, but also acknowledging that this isn't the medium that a lot of people like to ask questions. So I'm very much open to people shooting me an email, and I can address them at that point.
That's great, Andrew. Thank you very much. Yeah, like Andrew said, if you do have any questions, I have a couple that maybe I can kind of get the ball rolling here. First one, if I have limited space to do locomotion work, what can I do?
Absolutely. So, I think about, again, being from Cambridge, and I'm assuming none of the Cambridge counselors are going to be listening to this call. So we have some garbage rinks in Cambridge. So I think about, a place like a Dixon Arena or Duncan McIntosh Arena. If there's anybody in the GTA, you guys probably don't know these rinks, but I'm sure you have rinks down there that are similar. There's nowhere to do this stuff. Like, you just can't. So what I would do is, you can still do a lot of these things, even if it's stationary. Yeah, you might feel like a goof, but even if you're in your dressing room, or literally you're lining the hallways, you can still skip in one place, right? It's just a matter of checking your ego at the door. It does get challenging a little bit when we talk about like side shuffling and things like that, but maybe that's where we're just kind of pulling out a few different types of protocols. So maybe at this point, you can easily set, if we talk about the agility ladder work, and I'll put agility in quotations, you don't have to have this 30-foot long agility ladder. You can take 2 pieces of hockey tape, 4 pieces, if you will, draw a little box in front of your stall or where you're getting changed, and do it in that one place. All right. So it just takes a little bit of creativity. Instead of saying, oh, I can't, well, how can I? And just switch it up like that.
Excellent. Seeing as there's no, I'll ask another one here, Andrew. How can I tailor my warm up more to my unique needs?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and this comes back down to understanding who you are as an athlete and auditing where your gaps are. So I'll use an example. Let's say someone does have access to what we call force plate technology, where we can actually do a jump and we can quantify what components of the jump are you lacking in. Um, and that will give you more direction. So, for example, when we do a counter movement jump, there's really 3 big phases. The first phase is that the point in which you kind of drop into the bottom of the jump. That's going to give us a number that's called your eccentric rate of force development, or your braking impulse, if you will. Then the second phase is called your amortization phase. So that's kind of how long does it take you to switch from that downward direction to the upward direction. And then the third phase is obviously that upward direction, so your propulsive or takeoff phase. So we can kind of subjectively figure this out. Like, if you have a hard time just like stopping your body and controlling momentum, then you can start to add in the hop series. Instead of just kind of worrying about hopping, you can just worry about getting from a top position and coming down and stopping yourself fast. Conversely, if you have someone that's super, super wiry, right? And they literally, they almost look like they can bounce, and they're springy and they're kangaroo-like. And we've probably all very much track and field related type athletes who are very bouncy. That athlete might value more from doing more explosive base work. So meaning they're starting in a very, very deep position and then doing a hop from a half kneeling position. Right. So you can start to just audit, what attributes you need to work on. And then the same conversation goes for your actual movement fluidity. Like, if you're not coordinated and you can't get your feet figured out, like, whatever, I'm a bad dancer, but like if you can audit, like, okay, well, what movements do I really need to work on? Where do I feel as though I'm not coordinated? That might present an opportunity for you to work on some patterns. And it just takes a little bit of you reflecting on who you are as an athlete.
Good, good, good. I don't see there's going to be any more questions here, so okay, we'll wrap things up for the session tonight. Want to thank Andrew again for taking the time, and thanks to those that attended tonight's live presentation. Make sure to visit the OHF website for all the presentation recordings, as well as the PowerPoint slide decks. And then stay tuned for our next live webinar on Tuesday, January 30th, where we'll be discussing hydration and nutrition with Anthony Wolf from Gatorade. So if you have any questions, my contact information is always available on the OHF website. So please feel free to contact me. And on behalf of the Ontario Hockey Federation, thank you again and enjoy the rest of your evening.